Hi friends. So today I am going to discuss about what exactly is a peer review and about two aspects of peer review, which are the single blind peer review and the double blind peer review. So essentially when we talk about peer review, we should point out that the entire structure of science or scholarship in general rests on this concept of peer review. So whenever you discover something new in science or in any scholarly field, you end up writing a paper on this topic. And there is a very well established template for writing a paper. Typically, a paper introduces a subject, provides certain literature and background, looks at some methods for solving a problem, presents some results and discussion, and then presents conclusions, and at the end there are some references. So these papers are then submitted by the people who are doing the work to different journals, and these journals then go ahead and publish the work. Now between this point of submission of a paper and its publication in the journal, there is something known as the review process. And this review process is very important if science is to be correct, if science is to be truthful, and so on. Because people may make mistakes, people's concepts may not be correct, and so somebody needs to vet or judge these results which they are presenting. So these are essentially the peers. So now the peers are effectively people who are domain experts in the subject in which you are writing your paper, and these people must have a level of expertise which is very high in the field. So most people require that peer should have a PhD degree. So that's one of the requirement. And very frequently the peer should also be working in some position in some institution which gives them some credibility. Now, what is the peer review process? Once the journal receives your paper, they go through it in a cursory manner. They look at its basic writing, whether you have followed the journal template or not, and so on. And then they make a decision whether to reject the paper straight away at that point because of stylistic reasons or not being in scope of the journal, or to pursue further. Now if they decide to pursue this paper further, they send it to 2, 3, 4 or even 5 peers in your field, and these are the domain experts. Now these peers are going to look at your paper and they are going to make a decision of rejecting the paper or accepting the paper with minor or major revisions. Now most people will give minor or major revisions. It's very rare that a paper gets in without revisions at all, because most of the time scientists and scholars are very well trained in critical or black hat thinking. So it's very hard for them to look at some content and not give some critical remark about that content. So if your paper is not critiqued in terms of its technical content or its results and discussion, certainly you can expect some comment about the length of the title or the number of references. It could be too high or too low. Maybe it could be about the depth of the introduction section, the fact that you have not motivated the paper well. Maybe your conclusion section lacks certain clarity, or maybe even the fonts in your graphs are too small. You do not use sufficient number of diagrams in your paper, and so on. So generally you will find some comments in your paper, and once you have got all these comments, you can make changes in your paper later on. So now once the referees or the peers have made these comments, they send it back to the journal. Now the journal management essentially looks at all these comments and they reach a decision. So they can reject the paper here, they can accept the paper with minor decisions or major decision. Sometimes they also reject a paper and ask you to resubmit, in which case you can go ahead and resubmit the paper. That is a case when there are very substantial number of changes need to be made in the paper, which may include a lot of new results which you may need time to do. So What is the role of the peers? Now, you can clearly see that the peers play the role of gatekeepers of science and scholarship. And so the peer review process is very important. Now, there have been people who have criticized the peer review process as being very subjective because, as you can understand, it is subject to various biases which are present in human reasoning in general. But because of the proliferation of science and scholarship, it's very difficult nowadays for somebody to read a paper and to figure it out if they are not a domain expert in the field. So if I were to write a paper on smart material fatigue in the shear mode and its use for vibration reduction, there are very few people who are going to be able to really judge the paper in terms of its content. And therefore, it's very important to have a good peer community to judge all these papers. Now, we look at two aspects of peer review. There is the single blind peer review and the double blind peer review. In the single blind peer review, you do not know who the referees are, but the referees do know who you are. So essentially, this is the regular case. I would say more than 90% of the journals follow single blind peer review. So this is the case where you write a paper, and in the paper your name is mentioned, your institution is mentioned, and so the referee does know your name and the institution at which you are working, the country where you are based, and so on. Now, some people do say that this may lead to some bias in terms of the judging of the paper, because certainly there is some tendency of human beings to be biased towards top ranking institutions versus lower rank institution, highly developed countries in terms of science and technology, and low developed countries in terms of science and technology, and so on. So these are facts in the game, and so we have to live with these, and the solution to these issues is to make your paper very good in terms of technical and stylistic content. Now, one of the ways to remove this problem is the double blind peer review. So in this case, when you submit a paper, you remove your name and the name of your institution and country from that paper. So all that is present is the title, and then below it the sections or the place containing your name and all is missing. You have essentially removed it from the document. And here the referee does not know you, and you also do not know the referee. So essentially both are blind in this case. So in fact, some journals are following this particular process, and this is considered to be a somewhat better process. But again, it's not taken off to a large extent, and if you have been submitting papers, you will see that most papers are single blind papers. So essentially, this is the basic concept behind peer review, and peer review not only extends to journals but also to conferences, also to thesis, and so on, because essentially in all these documents which are vetted by the academic system or the research system, you are relying on the judgment of the peers to make a final decision, and this is something which is very important. And therefore, one of the things you should do is that when you receive a paper to review, do a very thorough job with this paper, put on your critical or black hat and give a very thorough review of this paper, because peer review very frequently performed without monetary gain. So essentially all the people who are doing this review work are doing it for free. They may be doing it during their weekends, they may be doing it late at night, and so on. But it is very important part of the scientific process to uphold the truth of science. And therefore, we need to make sure that the peer review process stays as good as possible. And therefore, at both ends of the peer review, when you are writing a paper, you should keep in mind what your peers are likely to think. And even if you are a peer who is reviewing the paper, you should keep your eye on what the person receiving the paper is going to think. So it's important not to be very trenchant in your criticism, to restrict any criticism to the information in the paper and the content of the paper, and never to get into personality or any particular aspect which may hurt the person's feeling at a personal level, because that may be liable to certain deleterious consequences. So that's what I had for you today. I hope you benefited from this video. Stay tuned to my channel for more such videos, and do subscribe to my channel and spread its word throughout your network.